Welcome to Seniors Count. I'm your host, Tula Mal. On our show, we believe that you are the foundation on which Boston was built. So our goal is to connect you to resources, benefits, and information to enhance your life. Thank you for joining us. My guest today is Dr. Derek Isakowitz. He is an associate professor of psychology at Northeastern University in charge of the Lifespan Emotional Development Lab. He's here today to tell us why older adults are happy. Welcome.
Thank you.
So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about what is done at the Lifespan Emotional Development Lab?
Sure. In our lab, we research, we do studies involving questions about why we seem to get happier as we get older. We're interested in ways that people regulate their emotions at different ages. Are there certain ways of regulating how we feel that an older person is more or less likely to do than a younger person? There are very large-scale studies of happiness in people of different ages, and they tend to find that people in their 70s and 80s actually say that they're happier than people in their 20s and 30s. And so the question we try to pursue in our research is, what allows that to happen? Is it something about changes in experience, changes in the way that we work with our own emotions, changes in the brain? What is it that leads us, many people, to be happier later in life than they were when they were younger?
So I think emotion's a tough thing to measure.
Yeah.
It's not like, days of the week or how much water are you drinking, right? It's not a thing.
Right.
So can you talk to us about how do you measure this?
Sure. So a couple of things that are relevant about how we measure emotion. In terms of how people are feeling, we just ask people how they're feeling. We do that in a variety of different ways, though. It turns out there's no better way of finding out how somebody is feeling than asking them. There's no magic brain scan or skin physiology measure for happiness. So in all of our studies, whether it's using a rating dial or having people say a score out loud, we have people report on their own happiness level. But what we're really interested in is what are the behaviors that are associated with happiness? And we're particularly interested in how people of different ages use their attention, what they look at, like if they're watching television, to regulate how they feel. So in some studies, we measure what people look at, their attention, and then we also measure their happiness by asking them to rate how they're feeling as they're watching things on a rating dial. So we can measure their behavior, what they're looking at, and then their happiness, how they say they're feeling. And that's how we get a sense of the emotions they're experiencing and the behaviors that they're using to regulate those emotions.
Okay, so you talked about a dial, right?
Yeah.
Or then just like kind of on a survey, like feeling it. Are there any other ways that you track, I guess, emotion or mood?
Sure. So for emotion and mood, we generally would have people use a rating dial or write a score on a piece of paper. For example, I might say, imagine that 100 is the best you've ever felt in your whole life and 0 is the worst. How do you feel right now? But critically, when people participate in our research studies, they generally are exposed to things on a computer screen or a TV screen that might make some people feel bad, might be a little bit unpleasant. Nothing different than what you might see on television, but still things that might make some people feel bad. And then what we do, using a technique called eye tracking, is we actually track people's eye movements as they look at different sorts of videos and pictures. And then at the same time, we may ask them how they're feeling using the dial or using that 0 to 100 scale.
So you're tracking, so one of the ways is also, the other way is tracking eye movement based on a picture or a video.
Right.
So, and how do you track eye movement? So is there a camera watching them?
Sure.
Or?
So we have two different ways of tracking eye movements. In most of our studies, we use what's called a stationary eye tracker, and I think you have a picture of that.
Maybe they can bring it up on the...
Sure.
Yep.
And our stationary eye tracker is a system that attaches to a computer monitor. It shines a camera at the eye of the research participant. And basically we then say to the research participant, look at whatever you want to look at on the screen. And the eye tracker actually monitors in real time where they're looking on the screen. So if I show you a picture or a video, and then I use the stationary eye tracker, I can monitor where you're looking on that picture or on the video.
Interesting.
And interestingly, people cannot report on that accurately. If I say,
Yeah.
where'd you look?
Yeah.
It actually wouldn't relate that well to the eye tracking measure. So stationary eye tracking allows us, like on a computer screen or a TV monitor, to look at where people are actually looking. And then we can say, when we have a research participant, where were they looking and what was their mood like?
And then they're comparing it to what they felt.
Exactly. So that's our typical technology for studying age differences and how people use attention to regulate their emotion. More recently, we've also added a new technology called mobile eye tracking, and I think that there's a picture of that as well. And mobile eye tracking is a similar idea. It measures where people are looking, but it actually allows them to get up from the computer monitor and move around freely.
Oh, okay.
So imagine you're in your living room and you could turn on the TV, you could look at your computer, you could read a magazine, you might move from one place to another. And mobile eye tracking allows you to move around like you're at home or out in the world, but still allows us to measure attention when people choose to look at something.
So I could understand the stationary eye tracking, right? So there's an image and maybe it's something unpleasant, so maybe people are either looking at the blank space in the image or there's something in the background that's more positive, so they look at that, or the opposite. But how do you guys use the mobile eye tracking? I'm assuming you're doing this in the lab. So do you have multiple options for them to look at things?
So we have multiple options, multiple computer screens in most studies. Some studies will have news magazines. Some studies have something that looks like a TV. So there are lots of different choices. And then we can measure what people decide to watch, but then also how they watch it. So let me give you an example. There are some things that are disgusting but really interesting. Like they're gross, but we want to know about them. We're drawn to it. So let's say everybody, there's something disgusting that's on TV. Everybody wants to know about it. But and you may decide to watch it. You turn on the TV to that channel and you watch it and you really look carefully at all the disgusting, unpleasant things. You really want to find out as much about it as possible. Whereas for me, I still want to know about it. But maybe I don't want to see the yucky parts quite so much. So I'm still going to watch it. But if you look at my eye movements while I'm watching it, you may see I'm not looking at the yucky parts. I'm looking at the background, or I'm looking away a little bit. So we both are choosing to watch the same disgusting thing, but we experience it differently. And our question is, okay, well, what does that mean for how we feel? Do you feel better because you've given yourself over to it and looked at it totally? Maybe I'm nervous, so I don't want to see it, and that makes me feel bad. Or maybe because I look at it less, I feel better. And we look to see whether that varies between people, and then also whether it's different as we get older. And one theory that we test and that we're really interested in is the way that we look at these sorts of unpleasant or negative kinds of videos, pictures, movies changes as we age, and that is part of the reason why older people tend to say that they're happier.
So that's actually what I was going to ask you that. What have you found in comparing, and I'm assuming, well, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. So is it like big differences in age? So is it like a 20-year difference to see differences in the way people look, or is it shorter? I wonder.
Most of our studies compare college-age students to individuals in their 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Oh, okay.
So in some studies we fill in the middle-age group, but in most of our studies we compare young adults to older adults. And it's in those comparisons that we tend to see the biggest difference with the older individuals looking relatively less at negative, unpleasant things on the screen, and older people looking relatively more at positive, pleasant, happy things on the screen compared to younger adults. And it appears because as we talked about before, we not only measure where people are looking, we ask them how they're feeling, that for the people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, the more that they show this looking at positive, not looking at negative, the better they say they feel. And it's something that's sort of interesting is in our younger adults, they actually tend to feel better the more they look at negative. Like they want to get the disgusting stuff and it makes them actually feel better. But for the people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, we see that their looking pattern really does map on nicely to how they say they feel. The less they look at negative, the better they say they feel.
So that's really interesting. So if you're So your research is showing that if you're older, they tend to want to look away from the disgusting stuff towards more positive things, and it makes them feel better.
Yeah.
But if you're younger, you're kind of more interested in looking at it, but that also makes them feel?
Yeah, something about engaging visually with this negative, unpleasant material seems to be emotionally gratifying, but just for the young people.
So it's interesting to think about the spectrum. Like, how do they get to that other point?
Right.
Is that something you've thought about?
It's a great question, and it's really why we started doing this research in the first place. As we touched on before, a number of studies have found older people saying that they're happier. It's mostly cross-sectional studies, so people at one point in time, the 70s and 80-year-olds will say that they're happier than the 20-year-olds. It's not the same individuals being followed.
Okay, so that's cross-sectional?
It's cross-sectional.
Okay, all right. So it's not the same person being followed.
Right, exactly, because you have to wait a really long time to get to do those studies. So these studies come out and people say, how can this be? How can it be that people in their 70s and 80s say that they're happier? Are they just answering the question wrong or differently? Are they lying? How could that be? And so as researchers started to wonder about what might be the underlying mechanism for the age difference, one thing that kept coming up in sort of just conversations with people about, well, what could it be? Was this idea that really resonated with me that as we get older and we have more experience, our perspective on things change. People often say, well, as you know, now that I'm in my 50s or 60s, I have a different perspective on things. Things don't bother me as much. And this word perspective kept coming up. And to me, it was really very interesting. People kept saying, my perspective has changed as I got older. And that's what actually motivated me to start looking at attention and to use eye tracking. I thought maybe, quite literally, people's perspective changes. How they look at the world changes. And that's what got us to start doing eye tracking.
Physically, how do they look?
Right, like their actual visual perspective on the world. Does that change? And that's what really got us to do eye tracking. Now, of course, there are many other possible reasons, and we still don't know if it is the case that people's perspective changes. Why does it change? So it could be that as we get older, we basically become experts at regulating our emotions. A 20-year-old doesn't know how to do it. Basically, you try some things, some works, some things work, some things don't. And the problems that most 20-year-olds face, maybe not that serious, don't force them to learn how to regulate their emotions. By the time somebody's 70 and 80, they've had all these decades of experience. This works for me. This doesn't work for me. They know that already, so they can cut right to the strategy that works. One explanation that tends to come up around this idea of perspective is, one thing that may change with experience is, as we have more experiences regulating our emotions, we come to realize that things aren't as bad as we think they're going to be. We learn that we're more resilient than we think, we can handle more than we think, and that may change our perspective. If the perspective is, well, it's not that bad, I know things will be okay, then that may be something that changes as we get older. The final idea is that what changes is our interest in engaging with negative things. So one thing we think of is that as we get older, people just think, you know what? I'm not going to go there.
Yeah, I'm not going to watch the news.
I'm not going to go there. I just don't need it. It's going to make me feel bad. I don't need it. And you rarely hear 20-year-olds say, I'm not going to go there. 20-year-olds are always going there. That's what we do when we're young adults. But as we get older, we probably become more choosy about what things in the world around us we decide to engage with emotionally.
Yeah. So that, when you first mentioned your research, or when I was reading about it, that was my first thought, right? So when you're young, your 20s, you're just coming out of your parents' home, so you're interested in the world. You want to look at the yucky stuff longer because you want to know how it works, right? So then as you get older, you've seen it, you've been there, you've done that, so you technically don't want to experience, not maybe, I don't know, I was thinking, is that because I have more experience with it, or because I've, like I said, been there, done that, and when you're older, you want to focus on just the happier moments, right? So that was one thing. But another question that came up for me was, so the control group. So are you just getting older adults that are happier? Like, where are the older adults that aren't happy?
That's a great question. There are a couple of answers to it, and I do want to come back, if I remember, to this idea about timing that you alluded to before. We worry that all of our participants are extremely happy. It turns out when we look at their data, there's quite a range.
Meaning their demographics?
No, look at their actual ratings of how happy they are.
Okay, got it.
There's quite a range, so we do find that there are people with a wide range of happiness scores, not all happy people.
Okay.
It is true that in our studies, like in the studies I talked about before, we tend to find that on average, the older people say that they're happier than the younger people. So why might this be the case? Well, there are a couple of explanations. One extreme one is selective mortality. People with a history of depression have higher rates of mortality.
Yeah.
So when you look at people in their 70s and 80s, you're looking at the survivors, basically. So that's one explanation. Another is that there is this genuine maturational change. There is the possibility of a cohort difference. People born, people in the generations that are in their 70s and 80s now, in their whole life, have had a lower lifetime prevalence of depression than people in their 20s and 30s. So there may be some generational changes as well. So we think that it's some combination of these, some maturational differences, some generational differences, and perhaps some selective mortality. But to go back to the point you made before, there's this really nice theory that's been developed by Laura Carstensen, who's a professor at Stanford, that basically makes the argument that you just alluded to, that when we're young, we need to do things that are going to benefit us in the future, learn things, meet people, do things that benefit you in the future, even if it makes you feel bad. But as we get older, we don't need to do that as much, and we focus on the present rather than the future. And when we focus on the present, we care about how we feel. We make choices that make us feel good, and that is one way that we might explain this age difference in happiness.
Wow, I like that. So this research is currently happening, right?
Yeah.
So are you recruiting volunteers for it?
Absolutely. We have 2 grants from the National Institute on Aging to study the sorts of things we've been talking about, the effects of aging on attention and emotion regulation. And we have a number of studies that go on in Northeastern, and we're always looking for new research participants from the community to come and join us. And I believe that the contact information is going to be presented on the screen. We're constantly looking for people. We have a large number of really enthusiastic Northeastern undergraduate students who
you have a good base there.
they love working with people from the community to bring them to campus, to bring them to the lab, to participate in studies. So we're always interested in bringing in new people to participate.
So what can someone expect? So they find the number, they call you, whatever, they show up. What happens?
What happens is they'll spend about 2 hours interacting with some people from our research team, primarily Northeastern undergraduate and graduate students. They'll go through a variety of different questionnaires about how they're feeling, what their life is like, what their experiences are like. We'll have them do a couple of little memory kinds of tasks to see how their mind is working. And then we'll put them in one of our testing rooms where we have either a stationary or mobile eye tracker. And we'll show them different sorts of emotional, happy, sad, upsetting images, videos, and we'll record their eye movements as they look at them. We always make sure that our participants leave in a good mood, though, and that's basically it. It's very non-invasive. Most people who do eye tracking as a participant end up thinking it's pretty cool. You get to you have this machine that knows where you're looking, but you generally don't have to have anything on your body. There's nothing. It's really quite non-invasive, and all of our participants are asked questions about how they're feeling during the experiments, as we talked about before. And that's basically it. Almost all of our studies are one-time deals. Come in, try it out for 2 hours. If you like it, come back for another study. We have some studies that require 2 visits, but that would be the most. So any one study, it's a really small commitment. And we work really hard to make sure that our participants have a really great experience when they come to campus, not just interacting with undergraduates, but also seeing what psychology research is like and contributing to our understanding about aging. So we try our best to make sure everybody has a great experience. We have a parking spot for our participants. We also are right next to the Ruggles stop on the Orange Line, so we make it as convenient as humanly possible for our participants. There's also a small monetary stipend for all of our participants who come to the lab.
Great. Well, and if you're interested in participating, absolutely call the Elderly Commission, and we can connect you to the Lifespan Emotional Development Lab. So if you can believe, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you about your path. So I'm always very interested in how people, what made you want to research this, right? Because I looked at your resume, and this is something you've always been interested in. We have about 5 minutes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. When I was an undergraduate and I decided to be a psychology major, I thought that I would study child development. I had worked in summer camps with special needs kids, and I thought that was really interesting. That was what I was going to do. I was very determined undergraduate. And then I met a professor at a faculty dinner in my dorm. And this professor studied aging. And she had openings in a research lab. So the next quarter, I went and worked in her lab. And I learned that the study of adult development and aging was a relatively new field compared to the study of child development. And whereas in child development, to my undergraduate mind, the questions that people were studying were really interesting, but they were about like, how does this thing change from age 3 to 3.5?
Yeah.
In adult development, there seemed like there were whole decades of life that were hadn't really been studied by psychologists, and I just thought that was so cool.
Yeah.
19-year-old me thought that was just such an opportunity. But it's true that not many 19-year-olds find themselves really fascinated by studying gerontology and aging. So from that point on, I really was committed to understanding aging and psychological aging, and I really have been taken with this question of changes in happiness as we get older. I just think it's so fascinating, even though it's quite clear that various aspects of our mental functioning and our physical functioning get worse reliably as we get older. The possibility that our happiness and our emotion regulation stays stable or improves as we get older, I just think is so fascinating, and I want so much to understand it, that it just has kept me interested in this topic for the years since I was an undergraduate.
What did your parents or grandparents, if they were alive, think about like the fact that this is what you were interested in? Did you like use them as guinea pigs initially, like asking them questions?
It's always hard to test out your theories on your relatives, but I do think that it got me to think about my grandparents in a different way. One thing that I always do in my adult development and aging class is I get people to think about their grandparents and to think about what assumptions they have about aging just based on their experience of their grandparents.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So, our grandparents we have a special bond with them, a special relationship with them, and not every older person is our grandparent. And so it's interesting to think, I've tried to think in a nuanced way about it. The fact is, it's always hard to apply. When my grandparents were still alive, I still had trouble applying what I'd learned in my research to them personally. It's easier when it's somebody else's relatives, right? But I do think that understanding aging can really help us, and not just in our relationships with our parents and grandparents, but it's actually quite relevant, I think, for our own personal development. In gerontology, we have the saying that old age is the only stigmatized group that we all want to be a part of someday.
Yes.
We have a lot of sort of negative feelings, worries about our own aging, and some people just don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
And I think that learning about aging, and especially this idea that perhaps for many people, emotional experience gets better as we get older, I think it can make people face the realities of aging in a more effective way.
No, I agree. You stated perfectly. You know, this in our society, you know, being older is viewed in a negative fashion. But the people who are older seem to be happier. You know, and we're all getting there.
Right.
Every day we're aging, so we might as well learn how to be happier every day, right?
And I also feel like, you know, people who are in their 70s and 80s today, they have so much to teach us. They have a lifetime of regulating their emotions, and they're the success stories. And we already know that younger generations of people have more of a lifetime risk of depression. And so for me, I'm very motivated by this idea of what can we learn from people in their 70s and 80s today who are regulating their emotions, who are happy. And so I always like interacting with people because I learn about all the different ways that people try to regulate their emotions and what's worked for them. And it's really endlessly fascinating to learn those lessons from people who are in their 70s and 80s today.
Well, Derek, thank you so much for coming here and talking to us about this. For our audience, this information will also be in our February issue of Boston Seniority. They have the lab wrote an article, and there's information for recruitment there as well. So thank you so much, and good luck.
Great.
And
thank you very much.
We'll have to have you again to talk about whatever new research you're doing.
Talk about the results. Great. Thank you very much.
So thank you for watching Seniors Count, brought to you by Mayor Martin J. Walsh and our Commissioner Emily Shea. To contact us, please call 617-635-4366 or the Mayor's 24-hour hotline at 617-635-4500. You can email us at elderly@boston.gov, and you can also find us on Facebook. Take care, and see you next time.
And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself,